This is a really bad picture, but it's showing my good side. So, very nice to be here and talk to you today. I'm going to give a talk that is called Startups in the Age of Unicorns. And it's a talk which is aimed at investors, startup founders, and anyone interested in general in how startups work and what the process is of raising money. So, without further ado, I'll kick off. It's called Startups in the Age of Unicorns because we live at a time when there are a very large number of companies that have reached $1 billion in valuation but are still private companies. And that's what a unicorn is. A unicorn is a company that has reached $1 billion in valuation from a private investor before they go onto the stock market. The first slide, I have to point that way, is going to show you a little bit about this. So this is from the Wall Street Journal starting 2 years ago. And if I click play, you'll see that it goes from around about 40 companies 2 years ago that had a $1 billion valuation to today, when it finishes, takes a little while because there's a lot of them. There are now 154 companies that have a valuation of $1 billion or more. You can see from the arcs, and there are a small number worth 40 billion and still private. One of those, of course, is Uber. I think the other one is probably a Chinese company. You're right. So the first point to make is the unicorn phenomenon is real. It isn't a made-up Silicon Valley thing that is fictitious. Although I will tell you, I personally have had 2 unicorns. One was a company called EasyNet in the UK that I started in 1994, and the other one was a company called Real Names that I started in Silicon Valley in 1998. Both of them were unicorns, and I'm not a billionaire. So being a unicorn doesn't necessarily mean you get rich. It just means the company for some period of time is valued over $1 billion by a private investor. Down below, you can see the growth curve over time. So you can see that even though it's leveled off, this unicorn phenomenon really accelerated in the last 3 or 4 years and became very big. And some people think that because investors went crazy. I'm going to explain what really caused it. This is the Crunchbase version of that slide, and the number you'll notice is bigger, 191 unicorns measured by Crunchbase. This one is exited unicorns. That is unicorns where company went public or was acquired. There are only 53 of those. So 191 to 53. The 53 really delivered money to people. The 191 not yet. They may do in the future. Next slide, if I'm not getting it. This is the year the company was founded. The year it was founded. In other words, how fast did it become a unicorn? There's even a couple founded in 2015 that became a unicorn within 12 months. So from 0 to unicorn in 12 months. My 2 unicorns, EasyNet was founded in 1994. It was a unicorn in 1999, so that took 5 years. Real Names was founded in 1997 and became a unicorn in 1999, so that was 2 years. So the length of time to a unicorn changes over time, but now they can happen real fast. How many unicorns did you fund? And if the answer is 0, they don't get invited to dinner. If the answer is more than 0, they do get invited to dinner. So it's become almost like a status symbol, and you know how hard it is to have a meeting with you is related to how many unicorns you invest in. So Mark Andreessen, it's very hard to get dinner with him because he's in a lot. He's very exclusive. With me, you can have breakfast, dinner, and lunch, no problem. The way the funding environment has changed is this, and I'm going to go back, the top line that says historical. This is how startups used to be funded. You used to come up with an idea, build a team, And then you would get to product market fit. That is to say, you built the product, you delivered the product, and people liked the product. Then you would raise a Series B. In the case of real names, I raised $5 million Series A in 1997 before I had a product. In 1998, I raised $13 million and went on to raise another $70 million during the same year, a Series C. And this was normal. But today, the bottom line is normal. The bottom line is that in 2016, there are many, many more startups than there were in 1999. There are around about 4,000 startups every year in Silicon Valley alone, double that worldwide. A typical startup will have to go through 3 or sometimes 4 rounds of financing called seed rounds before a venture capitalist even pays you any attention. And these seed rounds can be valued at $1 million and you raise $100,000. Maybe the next one, $1.5 million, you raise $200,000. Maybe the third one, it's $500,000 and your valuation is $2 million. The venture capitalist will only get interested once you're successful. Why? Well, they're looking for unicorns. And the only way they know whether you will be one is to look at what you've actually done. This is called traction. They look at your traction. Now a venture capitalist does not invest in an idea. They do not invest in a team. They invest in proven growth. And for that reason, they're very risk averse. There's a popular belief that in Silicon Valley, people just throw money at anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that is so they take less risk. And that is how the unicorn phenomenon has begun to shape the funding environment. Next slide. So this is a joke, and this is from the point of view of a founder of a company. You are forced to eat seed rounds over and over and over again until your product works. And of course, getting too much seed, you don't have any company left because you've given it all to your seed investors. So you have to be extremely focused on getting to growth fast. If you don't get to growth fast, you'll die. This is talking about the difference between VCs who invest when you're successful versus Mark Andreessen, who is prepared to invest before you're successful. He makes the point that mediocre VCs want to see that your company has traction. They're mediocre because they have no imagination. The only thing they understand is a spreadsheet. And if your spreadsheet says you're going to be big, they will give you money. And if you don't yet have a spreadsheet, they won't. On the other hand, the top VCs want you to show them that you can invent the future. And if they see one of those, they'll invest more money earlier. And so what has really happened is venture capitalists bifurcated into 2 groups. The numbers-driven, spreadsheet-based venture capitalists and the product-focused, big-picture venture capitalists. There's only about 3 or 4 firms in the second category. Almost every VC firm is in the first category of spreadsheet-based. Next slide. There we go. I did it twice. Let me go back. So the money in Silicon Valley is shaped by this. Oh, I went back twice. There are 3 buckets of money. The first bucket is for seed, the second bucket is for venture, and the third bucket is for growth. Seed is the $100,000, the $200,000. There's about $5 billion in Silicon Valley. And by the way, these numbers are roughly proportionately the same everywhere in the world. If you ask in Lebanon, the pattern will be the same, even though the absolute amounts might be smaller. Notice that in the middle, it's smaller than the beginning. There's less money for venture than there is for seed. And that means that most seeded companies die because they never get to venture. The death rate is about 90%. And then there's a huge amount of money for growth. If you look at the number of companies competing for these buckets, So it's the exact opposite in terms of the numbers of companies. So what this tells you is that doing a startup is incredibly hard. The most likely thing to happen is that you will raise money and die. And only the special ones will get through. And indeed, there are 180 funds, these are them, 180 funds in Silicon Valley with $100 million or less doing the seed investing. Lots and lots of venture firms. On the other hand, there are firms like this. This is Sequoia Capital's growth fund, investing $10 million or more in a single deal at the growth stage. So you've got a bifurcation. I call it the valley of death. So given this, how should you think about startup ideas? I pressed. There we go. So the first thing to be said is that you should not be put off by the death rate, because suddenly there are 2.5 billion consumers in the world that can get your software 24 hours after you ship it and potentially put it onto their smartphone and use it. When I did EasyNet in the UK, we were an internet service provider. In order to get people to receive our software, we had to make a CD. You had to go to a store, buy a computer, get my CD, install my software on your computer, and only then would I have you as a potential customer. And that was very expensive, and most people never install the software. Today, you have two app stores, the Google Play Store and the iTunes Store. And literally, those two stores have over 200 countries available with one click. And everyone in the world with a smartphone can install your software in 24 hours. It's free, literally free, to distribute software to everyone in the world. So suddenly, the scale of a business from day one, even within 12 months, can go to hundreds of millions of users. But of course, and this is the death rate, most startups fail to build software that users want to use. Therefore, they die. And this is the death rate round to round. This is the linear version. That's the logarithmic one. It's the same graph. By the time you get to F, something less than 1% of the companies that began still exist. So it's dramatic. Therefore, by the way, failure should not be penalized, because failure is normal. So if your society punishes people who fail, they'll never try again, and you won't get the winners. The only way to get the winners is to fail, just like the only way to learn to do a heart transplant is to do it wrong until you do it right. The same is true with any science. Startups are like science, and you learn from doing it wrong and eventually get it right if you're lucky. So, if you want to be one of the winners, let me tell you how to be absolutely sure you put yourself into a small group of potential winners. And the first is to think historically. Think about change and where the world is going. And if we think about the past, the present, and the future, I clicked, there you go. If you come to me and you say, I built this website and it's amazing and it's going to do 1, 2, and 3, the very fact that you say website will immediately position you in my head in the past, because most people are using smartphones and apps these days. Very few people are using the web on smartphones. They're mainly using apps. So if you're building a website, you already put yourself in the past. I want you to be mobile at least, and that's been my point of view since 2011. I've only invested in mobile companies since 2011. In mobile, if you're going to come to me with a photo sharing app, I'm going to put you in the past, because there's already lots of photo sharing apps. There's already enough self-driving car companies. You need to be in the near future. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean the far-off future. What we're looking for is the near future, things which exist potentially soon, but don't exist yet. And there's two things about the present that give you a guide to how to think about this. The present is made up of two elements, if you think abstractly enough. There's what I call the living dead. The living dead are ideas that are alive but are not going to grow. America Online is the living dead. Probably the Lebanese telephone company is the living dead. Probably many of the banks are the living dead. The living dead are living, not dead, but are not growing. They're not going to get bigger and bolder and bigger. The second element is what I call the unborn child. Now, the interesting thing about the unborn child is it's already living. You can't see it, but it does exist. The best products are like this. Think about Uber. There were already taxis. There was already GPS to locate where a car is. There were already private drivers. There was already smartphones. Same with Airbnb. There were already rental properties. There was already websites, but nobody made it so that anyone with a property could become a renter. They didn't invent something truly new. They took something old and made something new from it. This is how new ideas that are in the near future are formed. So if you're considering to make a startup or invest in a startup, to me, you want to see the unborn child, not the living dead. And you know, the way you know it is that it feels strange. If you were from another planet and somebody came to you and said, I have a human being growing in my womb, you'd think you're nuts. Good ideas are like that. The first time you hear them, you think, wait a minute, I never heard that before. That seems strange. If you like the idea, it's probably too late for that idea. You have to be uncomfortable with it, but intrigued. And that suggests it doesn't already exist. It's something a little bit new. That's the unborn child. You have a chance to be one of these companies. And this is Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz talking about how hard it is to have one of these. Each year, 3,000 startups approach him with an introduction from somebody he knows, and they invest in 15 out of 3,000. 10 of those will die, so that's now 5 out of 3,000. 3 or 4 will prosper. And in the English language, prosper usually is a positive word, but in this context, it means that it'll be okay, but it won't be huge. 1 might soar to be worth more than $1 billion, a unicorn. And with great luck, once a decade, so now we're talking about 30,000 companies, not 3,000. Once a decade, one of them will become a Google or a Facebook. There are 803 VC firms in the US, and last year they spent $48 billion chasing that dream. Now, Uber itself is worth more than $48 billion. So the net return as an asset class is fine, it's good. But the chances of being one of those is very, very small, and that's what he's looking for. Well, it's all about storytelling. Storytelling is your only asset when you're a startup because obviously you don't have a business yet. You have an idea for a business, so you have a story. But your story has to make you an unborn child, not the living dead. So how do you do that? Well, it's kind of like writing a book. If you write a book, it needs to have 3 elements. A beginning. In a startup beginning, actually building some software or hardware, getting it in the market and seeing if anyone likes it. It's like your first chapter of a book. The publisher always wants to see the first chapter just to prove I can write, and if I write, to prove it's interesting. So you've got to do something. But your story isn't your first chapter. First chapter does not make a book. The second thing you need is an ending. An ending is a vision. Tell me what this will be if I invest in it. What will it be? Am I investing something that will be big enough to justify the effort? Reed Hastings from Netflix did this in a spreadsheet. All he had was a spreadsheet. He said, how many people live in the world? How many of those have a DVD player in the home? How many of those people rent DVDs? Of the people who rent DVDs, how many would prefer to use the mail instead of going out to the local store to get their DVD? And how many would prefer not to pay late fees if they return it late? And then how much would they pay for that? It was a very small spreadsheet. It could fit on one screen. That spreadsheet showed he had a multi-billion-dollar business in 5 years just from the US, UK, and Germany. And a much bigger business over 20 years. Stuffing DVDs into envelopes and mailing them out. It was tiny. But the investors, when they saw those two ladies, they'd already seen the spreadsheet, put it in the context of the ending. This was big, even though it was small. And every startup founder needs to be able to plot for an investor to see what it could be when it's finished. If you don't do that, you can't make the investor feel greedy. An investor writes checks when they feel greedy. They never write checks when they're scared. Your job is to make them move from being afraid to being greedy, because they want to own a piece of your company because they believe it will make them money. And only a story can do that for you. The third element in a book is the plot. Well, the plot in a startup is your roadmap. How do you get from the beginning to the end? There's only one thing left. Unlike a book, which starts at the beginning, the story of a startup starts at the end. You have to talk about the end first. Why should he even care, or she? Why should they even care about your startup? You talk about the end first. Then you talk about the beginning to prove that you can do it. And then you show the roadmap and the team to get that roadmap built. That way, that person, that investor will have listened to maybe 8 people that day, because you'll sound different to the other 7, because you'll be putting your idea in the context of a big outcome and then showing how you can get there. It isn't good enough to only have a vision. You have to have the vision, the execution, and the roadmap. So that is how you've got to think about a startup in the age of unicorns. To summarize, create for the near future, not the present or the past. Second, think big. Don't go in with a small idea and show how great you've been at making this little puppy. Show the big idea. Third, think long-term, not short-term. You're going to change human life somehow. What impact will that make on the world, and why is it worth caring about? Long-term. It doesn't mean ignore the short-term. And then finally, tell a compelling story that begins with the end. And if you do those 4 things, there's a very good chance you put yourself in a very small group of companies that are candidates to become a unicorn, and therefore fundable. Otherwise, you will die. The end. Thank you.